Program Director, the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, Your Excellencies, ambassadors who are here, Professor Mello, distinguished audience. I haven't listened to the previous speakers. I perhaps thought maybe I should just take a bit of a different approach in terms of this discussion, and maybe look into a little bit of context with regard to Venezuela. Venezuela has about 303 billion barrels of oil in reserve, the largest in the world. The US produces about 12.9 million barrels of oil per day, and it consumes 19.7 million barrels of oil per day. So it has to make up for the deficit. The challenge of oil that the US has, it's able to import large quantities of oil from the Middle East to make up for the shortfall. But with the dynamics that are taking place in the Middle East, it presents a dilemma for the United States. And the buildup of this conflict that we are seeing in the Middle East, it compounds the challenges of the United States. As we are talking, the Strait of Hormuz, the Iranian government is said to have deployed some hypersonic missiles to counter the encirclement that is building up around there. But that raises serious challenges in terms of the movement of oil and gas around the world and the supply chain around the world. Compounded, of course, by the fact that there's a stranglehold on the Strait of Bab al-Mandab, that the Houthis have absolute control around it. So these dynamics have serious impact in terms of the global supply of oil and gas around the world. And big countries that really consumes large quantities of oil are seriously impacted by this. Not only the United States, China, it's also impacted by this. China, compared to the US, I think China consumes about 15 million barrels of oil per day. And I think China produces in the range, I don't have the statistics with me here, in the range of 5 to 6 million barrels per day. So there's a big need and demand for oil. So the appetite for oil within the United States system, it's something that is not going to rescind now. 5 years ago, the Russians decided to flood the market with oil. And it puts down the price of oil, if I recall, close to $40 per barrel. And that decimated the oil industry in the United States, particularly around Texas, because they have deep oil drilling. So if oil prices pushes down to $40 per barrel, it's not conducive, it's not profitable. That's why a lot of companies were compelled to shut down. But that's the leverage that the Russians are having. That's why the argument around the boycott of the Russian oil that is being advocated by the United States has to do with this geopolitical dynamics and the balance of forces, and to ensure the survival of the oil industry within the United States. Venezuela, it's one of the richest countries in the world. The population of Venezuela, I mean, they stand at about 28 million, Ambassador. And the GDP of Venezuela, it's 108 billion dollars. But the challenge is the inflation of Venezuela, which is projected to be at about 180% as we are talking. At the height of the problems in Venezuela, the inflation, Venezuela had hyperinflation. There are certain issues that I thought maybe I should bring to the fore for the purpose of this discussion here around the oil industry in Venezuela and the evolution of the oil industry in Venezuela. The nationalization of oil in Venezuela did not begin during Hugo Chavez's period. Ironically, nationalization of the oil industry in Venezuela was spearheaded by a center-left president, Rafael Caldera, who was the president of the Christian Democratic Party. He began the whole process in the 1970s of the nationalization of petroleum industry in Venezuela. Later on, of course, Venezuela set up the PDVSA, which is a governmental company to really run the oil industry. What Hugo Chavez did, because the nationalization that time was 50-50, was to insist on the profits dealing with large part of poor people in the country. And by doing that, Hugo Chavez stepped on the toes of a lot of people within Venezuela. And that's where the challenge really began. And it must also be stated that, before the nationalization of oil industry in Venezuela, which was primarily held by the United States companies and British companies, the Standard company that later was dismantled within the United States because of its monopoly position. And from that, you've seen Exxon and the Gulf Corporation. Also, the Royal Dutch got involved in this 50-50 arrangement. But when nationalization was done in Venezuela, these companies were paid by the government bonds, and there were retrenchment packages that were provided to everyone. There's a dispute around the retrenchment packages, Ambassador. Some views are that the retrenchment packages were not paid fully, and hence creating a huge problem, particularly within the United States. Venezuela in 1943 passed the hydrocarbon law, and when it was passed, it was always a 50-50 in terms of the control of the oil resources even at that stage. Venezuela is a founding member of OPEC in 1960, but OPEC has been very quiet even during these turbulent times. They are not saying anything. If you look at the ranking of countries with most resources around the world, Venezuela ranks number 10, with resources that are estimated to be about $14 trillion. US dollars. At the top of that, number one is the Russian Federation at 73 trillion US dollars. And the United States is number two at 45 trillion US dollars in terms of the overall resources. And in that ranking that I've seen, they are ranking 10 countries. Venezuela is number 10, so it tells you how rich is Venezuela. It's the United States driven mainly by its quest for oil reserves, or are there bigger strategic issues in terms of the evolving situation in Venezuela? I would argue that the narrow focus around Venezuelan oil, it sometimes masquerades and hides the bigger intention around the geostrategic realignment of forces around the world. And I think it's a bit unfortunate for a country as strong and powerful as the United States to want to focus on the Southern Hemisphere. What Monroe described in his doctrine of the Monroe Doctrine. The United States is bigger than that. The United States should have the ambition to influence global issues beyond the Western Hemisphere, particularly during this period of turbulent time, realignment of forces, multipolar world. The new sources of this multipolar world are yet to be clearly defined. I'll be very delighted at one stage, Professor Mello, to hear from your output in terms of the sources of power in this multipolarity. What are they? What are the sources? How do you project this power? Traditionally, the projection of power has been through military and economy. Are we still talking about the same thing when we talk about multipolarity? If the focus is as narrow as economy and military, aren't we having a challenge in terms of the realignment of forces and the distribution of power among states? I don't know, I don't have solutions about the new sources of power. But I've seen last year, between September and October, when the motor industry was about, literally, the motor industry was about to collapse because of action taken by Nexperia, which is a semiconductor company based in the Netherlands, owned by Chinese. And they decided to invoke 1945 law in nationalizing it. What did China do? Push the plug and not supply key ingredients that are required by Nexperia. Ambassador, you know, companies like Nissan, they were on the verge of shutting down their plant, closing down temporarily. Volkswagen Group, I mean, if you look at Volkswagen Group, Volkswagen has about, if I'm not mistaken, close to 10 to 12 company advocate Mantula, if I remember. They're about to shut down. And the pleading then began to reach out to China. Secretary Besant had several meetings to convince the Dutch to reverse their nationalization. And eventually, what I think is the biggest catastrophe was averted, because Nexperia produces key ingredients for fighter jets and for medical-related equipment, including the CT scan and so on that President Trump uses very often. So averted that. Is that a new source of power? How you project your mineral resources to engage? I don't know. That's why I'm saying to really confine the challenge of, or the conflict between Venezuela and the United States to oil is to miss the bigger picture that is evolving. And because of this evolving bigger picture that speaks to the sources of power in the new multipolar world, and because these sources are not clearly defined, I mean, I just gave you the Xperia example, which I think is a source of power that the Chinese are projecting. And my own postulation is that in the next few years, you are unlikely to see tariffs imposed against China. Because China, somebody says, Trump said, well, I have all the cards, but the cards are made in China. So China knows how to project its power, and it has used the question of the rare earths, which are 17 of them rare earths, and China produces what is called the 5N. Now, the 5N is the high level of semiconductor. It's 99, it's 5N, 99.999%. And I think it's only China that has reached that level. Taiwan, it's 4 Ns, I think. That's why China holds the cards. They've imposed sanctions on the use of semiconductor for military purposes in the United States, which is causing a serious problem for Americans. And China is developing the end user. They are able to track the end user as they sell this. I tend to believe that China has started to define some of the sources in this multipolar world, source of power in the multipolar world. How all of us are going to start defining, including Venezuela, how to use your resources as a projection of power and a projection of engagement with the rest of the world. It's an issue that we are yet to see. You would recall when the first attacks began around Venezuela, the issue was to attack drug cartels, which raised serious concern within the other side of Pennsylvania, when particularly the United States went on to attack people who were already injured, literally finishing them off, because in terms of international law, you are not allowed to do that. And Congress was up in arms about this. And the communication between Pete Hegseth and the White House was lost in terms of defining those issues. And I think that Capitol Hill has made a decision still to want to take Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, to task about what happened and why did the United States do that, because it's also in violation of the United States law in terms of the conduct in combat. So we're going to see what's going to happen to that. So because the focus was on this projection that the United States is attacking these boats because these are boats carrying drug cartels, a strategic mistake was also made by the United States in the process in terms of framing the communication around this. And I'll come back to that later on. You may have heard about what the US was calling the cartel de los Solos. Now the cartel de los Solos was said to be a drug cartel that operates in Venezuela, and at the pyramid of that drug cartel was President Maduro. But in reality, this terminology, the Venezuelans are using it to refer to government corrupt officials, not drug cartel. And a lot of information was coming out to say this is a meaning, and the United States refused to accept that. And I'll come back later to this issue. You may have seen during the press conference by President Trump immediately after the kidnapping of President Maduro, the statement by President Trump, Peter Hegseth, and Marco Rubio, very problematic if you listen to that press conference. President Trump spoke about they've stolen our oil, it belongs to us, we're going for our oil. That was the thesis of President Trump's statement. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, was talking about going after drug cartels and projecting this as a law enforcement operation. Marco Rubio was talking about going after dictators, election having been stolen by President Maduro and so on. So 3 statements were issued out. This is so fundamental. That are literally not defining the strategic purpose of the mission. And this was relevant in terms of the other side of Pennsylvania. That's why the other side of Pennsylvania was quite alarmed. And they needed to understand and to get a briefing, and the briefing was done. And this briefing was done in the closed sessions. Because in terms of the US law, you can't go and remove a government because it's a dictator. The question of oil, that they've stolen the American oil, that oil belonged to the United States, it's not correct. It's going to raise a serious challenge within the White House, within the Capitol Hill. Hegseth's statement as the support for law enforcement was the most plausible that could be accepted within the US political system. But by then, they've already muddied the water by coming up with the statements. This is relevant because when they want to take this case to court, these issues are going to play themselves out very strongly. That's why a few days later, Pembody at the Justice Department retracted the argument that Cartel de los Solos is a drug cartel. It was not a mistake for the retraction of that, was to try to manage the case that is now sitting in New York against President Maduro and the wife, because evidence would have emerged as to what this is all about. Now, if that is the purpose of retracting the statement, what is the solid basis of the attack of the small boats that other people are saying these were shipping boats, nothing to do with drug cartels and so on? So the case is quite compromised. There are serious challenges with respect to the case. I think my other colleagues have spoken quite eloquently here about the violation of international law by the United States in terms of the abduction of President Maduro. But the situation is evolving in Venezuela. A day, 2 days ago, I learned that President Delcy Rodriguez, she will be, I think sometimes last week, she'll be visiting Washington. And she's confirmed that she would go, even though there's a pending warrant of arrest against her, but she would go, meaning that the administration would make it possible for her to go. Yesterday, I heard that she's going to try to privatize the oil industry. if she privatizes, if indeed the privatization is correct, and if she privatizes that, or come up with any form of loose arrangements around the ownership, because in terms of international law, oil belongs to Venezuela. Once it has been extracted, then it can belong to somebody else, sold to somebody else. If she's going to relax that, what does it mean? Does Venezuela have, as we are talking, Ambassador and colleagues, does Venezuela have the guts to resist everything that comes out of Washington at this time? Do we really expect Venezuela to resist every conditionalities that are put by the United States? I don't know if Venezuela has the necessary power to do that. There are three conditions that President Trump spoke about that he would like to see. One of them is that Venezuelan oil should not be sold to the US adversaries. And these adversaries are mentioned, three of them: the Russian Federation, People's Republic of China, and Iran, ironically. Iran has enough reserve. They just discovered 120 million barrels in the last 4 months. That's one condition. The next condition that the Americans are putting in terms of this is that Venezuela needs to have elections, which they realize later on it's not going to be possible to have elections under the circumstances. The third key conditions were that this oil must be sold to the US, or it must go to the US. To manage that deficit that we spoke about earlier, and the projected conflict that may arise and the tension that is there in the Middle East. And my understanding is that President Rodriguez, she refused all these conditions. Do we really expect all of us, Venezuela, to refuse every condition imposed by the United States, given the stranglehold that the United States has on Venezuela? I think it would be unfair to expect them to resist everything. It would be fair to say to Venezuelans they must look for a pragmatic solution that would also protect and save their own sovereignty. If you were to ask me what is that, I don't know. Maybe the ambassador can tell us at one stage. But they need to find a solution to manage their conflict with the United States. Some people may call it a sellout position because Maduro is sitting in prison. But the republic must also survive during these turbulent times. So the balancing act that the current president is going to employ, with the level of scrutiny that all of us are providing, looking at everything that they are doing, and being very critical on anything that is seen to be a concession to the United States, will be unreasonable. There are agreements that Venezuela has made with the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation. Venezuela has to honor those agreements. These are agreements between states. It doesn't matter which government comes into place. The state of Venezuela would have to honor those agreements. To get out of them, they would have to renegotiate with parties concerned. We know China has given large sums of loans to Venezuela, and they would have to manage those responsibilities. I listened on Friday the appearance of Marco Rubio at the Capitol Hill around this issue of the legal obligation of Venezuela towards these countries. He was wishy-washy on this issue. What he only said is that as of last week, Friday at least, he said they've sold about 500 500 billion, no, 500 billion worth of oil, and 300 billion, is it million or billion, Ambassador? I'm getting confused about.
The reserves.
Billions, huh?
Reserve 300.
Yeah.
Billions.
Billions. And they've sent back 300 billion. They are holding 200 billion. And the question was, who is in custody of the 200 billion? He said, he's a treasurer. So what they will do is as they sell this oil at market price, I think they've taken close to 6 to 7 ships of oil, tankers of oil, they will require the Venezuelan government to provide motivation for budget, what is the money going to be used for, and they would release that. And that's totally taking the sovereignty of the Venezuelan state away. What kind of ending all of us are looking for? Maybe it's a wrong question to ask us sitting here, because maybe we are biased, all of us, in one way or another. But I think we should look for a solution that would alleviate the challenges that normal Venezuelans are having. Ambassador, I'm a student of conflict resolution. And I've done a little bit of research around militias. And I've tried in my PhD research to argue about a theoretical concept that I called the 5th generation civil militia groups. And I argue that these militia groups, because militia has been an integral part of government system. You have the second, I'm speaking about 3rd generation civil militia groups. The 2nd generation are support services, auxiliary services the state calls at any time. But you have militias that are very fluid. They don't belong to anyone. And when I look at the Venezuelan situation, it has all the ingredients of this 3rd generation civil militia groups that are fragmented along very parochial interests. And you start to see people organizing themselves for extortion and all sorts of other activities, and not paying taxes, and literally balkanizing the state. And I looked at the research I did, I looked at the behavior of civil militia groups in Somalia. At the heart of that is a proliferation of small arms. When the tension was building up between the United States and Venezuela, the distribution of small arms by the Venezuelan government. And if they don't manage that, I think it will likely create a problem for them moving forward. Because you're gonna get people who are starting to use that as a source of livelihood, and that you have no control over it. So it's something that it's alarming when I look at that. But with respect to my own theoretical concept, these civil militia groups, they exist where the question of the identity is very prominent. And the identity can be developed. I mean, if you look at the Somalis as a society, they're quite homogeneous. The divisions are limited to patrimonial lineage and so on. I don't know, I haven't done a research in Venezuela to look at how the society is composed and what are the likely pressure points for further division that may create this phenomenon, which once it's created, it's a huge problem. It's something that I think, where I'm sitting, needs to be better managed moving forward, because the proliferation of small arms and this kind of conflicts, they thrive on the basis of small arms, not big things. And now sitting at the center of the challenge, the challenging dynamics in that part of the world, Venezuela needs to navigate that situation with utmost care. Let me conclude. I wouldn't like to revisit what my other colleagues have spoken about the violation of international law, and particularly Chapter 2 of the UN Charter in terms of responsibilities and functions of the state. I think all of us are waiting to see the challenges of the charge sheet that the United States would have. I said I'll come back to the issue towards the end. A precedent has been set in the United States when they went to capture Manuel Noriega. They framed that as a law enforcement operation. But they've already fragmented the argument around the law enforcement operation, given the three statements that I later spoke about that came from the three principles during the press conference explaining this. Because in the United States, they've accepted that. And because sometimes, particularly in most cases, the extraterritoriality behavior of the United States, it comes up very strongly, and it's accepted. But this one is going to create a problem within the Capitol Hill in terms of the strategic thrust of the mission, and given the statement that was said by the three principles, if that will stand the United States legal scrutiny. I sometimes have my own challenges about the United States. I'm not a lawyer, I know nothing about the law. Maybe Advocate Mantulio can teach me something there. I don't know how they're gonna frame their argument, having made pronouncement about the purpose of the operation to capture President Maduro. And given the three contradictory statements, but I think the statement by the president around the oil would hold water more than anyone else. So we'll see how this situation evolves moving forward, and the precedent-setting nature of the state behaving in this manner, as my other colleagues have eloquently spoken about, to see how that is going to be managed. I know other people are saying, well, maybe this is an arrangement, it would give excuses to Xi Jinping and to Putin to carry on with their intention. I don't know. There are bigger strategic global issues that are at play here, and all of us are struggling to get this. I wish I was a fly in the wall when the top secret briefing was given to the House to understand most of those details that are there. It would then make sense for us to unpack in details the strategic thrust of the operation. But as it is, it remains quite obscured by a lot of questions. I thank you.